Welcome back, Bio. We are continuing our discussion of Module 13 of Phylum Chordata. Some housekeeping stuff before we keep going. Don't forget, vocab words are on Quizlet, and you need to complete the test section one time for your vocabulary quiz credit. In the previous video, we talked about the different subphylums of Phylum Chordata, and we covered subphylum Cephalochordata and Urochordata. And now we are going to be talking today about subphylum Vertebrata, so the vertebrates, and this is where we will be spending the majority of our time in Module 13, focusing on these organisms. All right, and so let's get started. This is an extremely large subphylum. It includes things like birds, mammals, and reptiles. And they carry some common features. Okay, so for one, their endoskeleton, their circulatory systems, their nervous systems, and their reproductive systems. So we are going to be focusing on all of these individually at some point in this module. Let's start with the endoskeleton. So vertebrates get their bodily support from an endoskeleton. So an endoskeleton differs from what we've talked about previously with exoskeletons because endoskeletons are skeletons on the inside of a creature's body, typically composed of cartilage or bone, so us, what we know as our skeleton. Now we covered other organisms that had the exoskeleton, like a lobster or a crayfish, and so on and so forth. So now we're focusing on those that have an internal skeleton or an endoskeleton. And now bone, which is what most of these endoskeletons are composed of, is made up of living cells called the bone matrix. And the bone matrix is made up of three types of bone cells: osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. And I will just throw this in there that if you will be taking my advanced biology class, aka Anatomy 1, at some point, either this coming fall or at another point, it would serve you well to learn this because you will cover this in-depth, very in-depth at a later point. So it's worth your while to actually understand and learn about the bone and the endoskeleton right now. All right, and so these three major types of cells that we find in bone each serve a very specific function. Osteoblasts promote formation of bone tissue by producing bone matrix. So these are the bone building cells. So I like to remember the B for blasts as building, B for building. So these are the cells that build bone. Then we have osteoclasts. These break down bone tissue for either reshaping or liberating minerals like calcium that are contained in your bone. Sometimes your blood needs more calcium, and so the osteoclasts have to come in and break down your bone to get that calcium out and into your blood. And then lastly, we have osteocytes. These are the mature bone cells that are surrounded by the bone matrix. And of course, you guys know that bones in general come in all shapes and sizes, and you'll have an opportunity to study those way more in depth at a future time. All right, so continuing with bones, bone tissues are composed of a protein that's called collagen, mixed with a calcium-containing salt that hardens the tissue. So you may have heard of collagen before. It's actually a pretty big buzzword right now in like the health and fitness industry and like the skincare industry because you need collagen for your skin, hair, and nails. And so it's kind of one of those gimmicky buzzword things that every supplement and hair care product on the line is promoting. But it's also an important part of your bone. And that combined with these calcium containing salts is what makes your bone really hard and a protective surface. The osteocytes that live within the woven fibers of collagen. And so if we were to look at like a microscope image, particularly like an electron microscope, a really strong, powerful microscope, you could see these osteocytes live woven within these individual collagen fibers and within the bone matrix of bone. And there are actually two types of bone tissue. So if you think about one of the bones in your body, for example, like say your humerus in your upper arm, the ends of the bone are going to be made up of spongy bone, and the middle part of the bone, or the longer shaft part of the bone, is going to be compact bone. And those are the two types of bone tissue that we see. So compact bone, it has fibers that are tightly packed. As the name implies, it's compact. And it's got a hard, tough structure that can withstand really strong shocks, like things like bouncing and jumping and beating up on it. Whereas spongy bone, the fibers are packed really loosely. So there's a lot of, it looks like a sponge, lots of space between the fibers. And this provides support, but it's important because it doesn't add additional weight to the bone. So it may not be quite as strong as the compact bone, but it still provides support without making your bones any heavier than they already are. So both types of bone tissue are very important. Now, compact and spongy bone tissue are surrounded by a very dense membrane around the whole bone. And that dense membrane is called the periosteum. And it contains blood vessels that supply the oxygen and nutrients that your bone cells need. So remember, bones are alive. It's easy to think of them kind of as like a dead material because they're hard and such, but they're very much alive. They contain those three types of cells, and so just like any other cell in the body, you're going to need oxygen and nutrients to keep those cells alive. And so that's what the periosteum provides. And vessels, like blood vessels, for example, travel through the canals that weave through the bone. So there's little tiny microscopic canals that go all throughout the bone, and that's where the blood supply and oxygen travel through to provide that nutrients. The periosteum also contains some nerves which send pain signals to the brain. So you feel those if you break a bone and you start to feel pain when the adrenaline wears off. That's because there's nerves in bone as well. The very center of the bone contains the bone marrow cavity. And bone marrow is a soft tissue that we find inside of bone that produces blood cells. There's actually two types of bone marrow, yellow and red. And the red produces red blood cells that we need. That's where all of your blood comes from. And the yellow is a fat storage for nutrients. If you were to be in starvation mode, you could pull from the yellow bone marrow inside your bones to provide you with nutrients and energy to survive. Additionally, bone functions to store minerals for later use by the body. As I mentioned already, if your blood calcium gets too low or too high, the bones come into action by either releasing calcium to raise your blood glucose level, not glucose, your blood calcium level, or they will start taking in more calcium and storing more calcium if there's an excess of calcium in your blood. And this is true for not just calcium, but other minerals that are important in your bone health, like phosphorus, for example. So looking at the structure of a vertebrate bone, you can see here this is the spongy bone tissue versus the compact tissue. There's a lot less little holes that we see here. And this entire thing is surrounded by the periosteum, as they've peeled it back here so you could see, which has the blood vessels and nerves. And deep within the bone is your bone marrow cavity. All right, so that was bone. Now we're going to talk a little bit about cartilage, because remember that some members of subphylum Vertebrata have their endoskeleton being made of cartilage versus bone. Most it's bone, but some it is just cartilage. Now, cartilage is also composed of collagen fibers, just like bone is, but it's not reinforced with calcium salts. So it's a lot more flexible and much weaker than bone is. And it also helps connect various bones. So you have a lot of cartilage in your body. I mean, if you've ever had your cartilage pierced, if you're a lady here, you can feel. I mean, it's hard. There's something crunchy in there if you move your ear around, but it's not as hard as a bone is, and it's flexible. So that's what we're talking about with cartilage. And it does connect many different bones in your body at joints. It also provides cushioning to the bones at the site of those joints. And most vertebrates develop cartilage prior to birth, but later replace it with bone tissue. But as I said, some organisms actually never replace that cartilage with bone, and they have more flexibility in their endoskeletons, which ultimately results in less protection and support. So, for example, as humans, we too actually have many areas in our body that start out as cartilage when we're in the mother's womb, or even when we're first born, that eventually it hardens, or what's called ossification. You don't need to know that for right now, but you will next year, possibly. But through that process, the cartilage turns to bone. So babies, you may have heard of someone say, like, you got to watch the soft spot on their head when they're first born, those early months, because that's cartilage that will eventually become skull bone, but it's not quite there yet. So it's not as protected, and that's why you have to be more careful. All right, and so we can actually split most endoskeletons into two major groups. We call those the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the portion of the skeleton that supports and protects the head, neck, and trunk. So the axial skeleton is made up of the vertebral column, the ribs, and the skull. So head, neck, and trunk. Whereas the appendicular is the portion of the skeleton that attaches to the axial skeleton and has the limbs on it. Okay, so it's the pectoral girdle, or your arms, and your pelvic girdle, which are your legs. And so you've heard of arms and legs being called appendages before, so appendicular appendages, that's where we get that name. And so this will be, when we say pectoral girdle, we're talking about like your shoulder blades, where your arms attach, and when we say pelvic girdle, we're talking about like your hip bones, where your lower legs would attach. And so all of those are included in the appendicular part of the skeleton. And you can see that here, they've put blue for the axial, the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column, and they've left it yellow for the appendages of the appendicular skeleton. Okay. And we're going to briefly just talk about the circulatory system of vertebrates before we finish out this video. So the circulatory system of vertebrates is a closed circulatory system. Remember, just about everything we've talked about up to this point has been open circulatory system, where the blood is not contained in vessels all the time. In a closed circulatory system, the oxygen-carrying blood cells never leave the blood vessels. They stay enclosed in the blood vessels. So that's an important distinction. Vertebrates' circulatory systems begin with a heart, and that heart is either composed of 2, 3, or 4 chambers, depending on which organism we're looking at. We, as humans, have a 4-chamber heart. The heart functions to pump blood into arteries, which carry it away from the heart. So I like to remember this, that arteries, which begins with an A, carry blood away from the heart. So they both begin with an A. Arteries, away. Arteries will eventually branch throughout the body, sending blood to capillaries. And so your capillaries are those really super tiny, thin-walled blood vessels that allow the exchange of gases and nutrients between blood and the cells. It also, of course, in addition to bringing blood, will also carry away carbon dioxide waste and other metabolic processes that need to be gotten rid of. Blood that has delivered oxygen and the nutrients and then picked up carbon dioxide and waste will then travel back to the heart in veins. So arteries away, veins go to the heart. Okay? They bring the deoxygenated blood to the heart. Okay? And so you guys know, but vertebrate blood is red, and the red blood cells are full of a compound or a protein called hemoglobin, which holds onto oxygen for transport in blood. And again, this information will serve you well in future classes if you take advanced biology, because we will dive way more deeply into this in Anatomy 1. But veins are typically closer to the surface, so when you look at your skin, if you're really pale like me and you look, the veins are what are typically closer to the surface, and they appear blue, but they're not actually blue, because blood is red. The blue color results from the fact that the dark red blood, which means it's low on oxygen, does not reflect light through the tissue as well as bright red blood. So you can see here in my 2 images, they look blue, but they are not in fact blue. It just is a trick your eyes are playing with the way the light and your skin react with those veins right under your skin. And so when red blood cells have a lot of oxygen attached to them, they're going to be really, really bright red. And when they're low on oxygen, they'll be a much darker shade of red. And that kind of is why we see that there. But that is going to be where we end these slides. I do have 2 videos that you really should watch below, so please just take a few minutes and watch those before you finish this lesson. They will help you solidify the understanding of all the concepts we just did, and they will be very helpful to you in the future. And with that, that is the end of this lesson. Have a great day.